Have you ever wondered how many times Aang bends each element in Avatar the Last Airbender? You probably haven't. Your brain probably works normally. I have. I've thought about it a lot. So today, we're going to answer that question. How many times does Aang bend each element in Avatar the Last Airbender? So, I've been wanting to do a rewatch of Avatar, and I'm going to do that. But this time, I'm going to run a little experiment while I'm rewatching it. I'm going to keep track of every time Aang bends each of the four elements, and I'm going to use that to answer this question. So, any experiment, of course, needs a reason to do it, right? Why am I doing this? Well, number one, I'm just curious. But number two, I think it could tell us something interesting about the way Aang develops as a character over the course of the series. You know, we can look and see how he grows into being the Avatar as he uses each of the different elements over the course of the show. And we can kind of track how the amount of each element grows or shrinks over the course of the series to track his Avatar journey. So that's why I'm doing this. But also, you know, what do I expect to learn here? What do I expect to see in these results? And that's where we come to the hypothesis. Again, any science experiment needs a hypothesis. So my hypothesis is going to be that, of course, air is going to be the element that Aang bends the most, right? It's the element that he starts with. It's the element that he has for the longest. It's the element that he's most comfortable with. So that is the one that's going to end up with the highest amount of bending. But as sort of an addition to that, you know, basic one that I think we can all agree is obvious, I'm actually going to say that I think water is not going to be his second most bent element, despite the fact that he learns water second in the show, right? You know, you would think because he has water for a pretty long time, it would end up being his second most bent element. But I actually think his second most bent element is going to end up being earthbending. I just don't really remember him doing a ton of water bending over the course of the show. I mean, he does some, but it doesn't seem like it's an element that he really reaches for that much. Whereas with earthbending, even though he learns it later, I feel like that's an element that I remember him using a lot once he did learn how to use it. So that's my hypothesis. Earthbending is going to be Aang's second most bent element. But we will, of course, only know the truth behind that once we look at the numbers. I also want to talk about my methodology for this. You know, how am I tracking this? What counts as an example of bending? So, you know, as I watch the show, I will make tally of every single time Aang bends each of the four elements. And that's going to be based off of, like, each individual move that Aang does, right? You know, I would say that that's going to be more of, like, a gut feeling in some instances. I have a suspicion that, you know, sometimes Aang is going to be doing one really long move, and then sometimes he's going to be doing, you know, multiple quick moves back to back to back. So, you know, that's just going to be a judgment call on my part of what counts as a move for a given element, what doesn't count as a move for a given element. I'm sure I'll have more to say about some of the specifics once I actually collect some of the data. But that's sort of going to be my method. I'm just going to make a tally of each element in each episode. I'm going to track each episode separately because I also think we might learn something interesting by looking at some, you know, weird outliers and that sort of thing. Finally, I do want to talk about the way I'm going to present the results. So After I watch each book, I'll report back with how much Aang bent each element in that book. Talk about anything interesting that stood out to me in, any individual episode. And also, I'm going to present not only just the raw totals, the raw numbers, which is obviously important, but I'm also going to present percentages and averages. I think these are also going to be instructive to have. So the percentages, the way I'm going to, reckon those is, let's say over the course of book 1, Aang airbends, 100 times, and waterbends 10 times, and never earthbends and never firebends. That gives us a total of 110 total bending in book 1. So then you would take that, I would take that number, and I take the number of times that Aang waterbent and do the math to figure out what the percentage of time that Aang waterbent was. So that's how I'm going to reckon the percentages. And again, I think that'll tell us something interesting about the way Aang, is the Avatar in that book. The other thing that I'm keeping track of, as I said, is the averages. So I'm not just going to do the total numbers and the percentages, but I'm also going to figure out, on average, how many times Aang bends each element in each episode. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take the total number of times Aang bent that element and divide it by the total number of episodes that Aang had access to that element. So in the example of book 1, let's say, again, Aang bends air 100 times. He has access to airbending for all 20 episodes. So that averages out to 5 airbends per episode in book 1. But waterbending, Aang has access to for much less of the book. So how's that going to work? I'm only going to count the episodes that Aang actually has access to waterbending. So Aang gets access to waterbending in the episode Waterbending Scroll. That's about halfway through book 1. I think it's episode 9 or 10, somewhere in there. So let's say 10, just for the sake of ease, right? If Aang gets waterbending in episode 10, then we're only counting episode 10 through episode 20 for the average. That's for both the total number of times Aang waterbent and the number of episodes he had access to waterbending. So, if you remember, in the second episode of the show, Aang goes into the Avatar state and does some waterbending. Well, Aang doesn't really have access to waterbending yet outside of the Avatar state. So I'm not going to count the waterbending that Aang does in episode 2 towards the average. It's going to count towards the total, but it's not going to count towards the average. It's also not going to count against the average. So I'm not adding that episode to the divide in the average. So outlier episodes aren't going to count for or against the averages, but they will count in the totals and the percentages. So I'm going to do that for each book to see what we learn about Aang's sort of shifting use of the elements over the course of the series. And then we're going to look at the total numbers for the series altogether. I'm not going to account any expanded media. I'm not going to go through the comics, say, and figure out how much Aang bent each element in the comics. So we're just going through the 61 episodes of Avatar the Last Airbender. So I'm going to go watch book 1, and I will be right back with the results. All right, I'm back after watching book 1. Here is the episode by episode chart, showing you how much Aang bends each element in every episode. There's some interesting things to look at here before we look at the totals and the final results for book 1. First thing I want to mention with the airbending totals in general is that Aang uses airbending for a lot of like little things in book 1. So he uses it to stand up quicker or cushion himself as he's sitting down. He does that quite a few times, so that sort of adds to the total quite a bit. The other thing I want to talk about with the airbending totals is, he does a lot of jumping. Not every single jump used airbending, but definitely some of them did. So that was often a judgment call on my part about whether or not I thought a given jump was an airbending move. And also when he chained a bunch of jumps together, I usually just counted that series of jumps as one airbending move, unless there was a long break in the middle of that. With the waterbending totals, something I want to mention is waterbending moves in general can be longer single elements. So unless Aang shifted control of the waterbending move away from himself, I counted it usually as one move. It varied episode to episode depending on what exactly was going on. Again, a lot of judgment calls with waterbending, the way it works with the pushing and pulling of water. So that was something I wanted to mention. There are some outlier episodes here. As I talked about, right, I would normally consider the Avatar state as sort of an outlier episode. So those numbers, that's still going to count towards the total. But if Aang uses waterbending in the Avatar state before he actually learns to use waterbending outside of the Avatar state, that's not going to count against the average. So episode 2, right, Aang goes in the Avatar state for the first time, and he uses waterbending, by my count, twice. With that, then, those 2 that's going to count towards the total, not going to count against the average. But at the very end of the season, in episode 20, when Aang goes into the Avatar state and merges with the ocean spirit, I did count that waterbending towards the total average because he had learned to use waterbending by that point. Other outliers, though, that we see here, I do have him counting 1 earthbending in book 1. This is in episode 8, The Winter Solstice Part 2. In The Winter Solstice Part 2, Aang goes into the Avatar state and kind of merges with the spirit of Roku in that use of the Avatar state. I did count those uses of bending towards the total. Now, he obviously firebends several times while Roku, by my count, 3 times. But where does the earthbending come from? Well, as we learn in The Legend of Korra, lava bending is an earth-bending technique. So when Roku, uses the lava underneath the temple to destroy it, that counts as earthbending. So that is going to add 1 use of earthbending to Aang's totals for book 1, but it is not going to count for the averages. Also, of course, there's the episode The Deserter, where Aang tries to learn firebending from Zhang Zhang. That's all the way down here at episode 16. And he firebends, by my count, 4 times in episode 16. So, again, those are going to count towards totals, but I'm not working that into an average of any kind because it is very much an outlier episode, right? Aang only uses firebending in this episode. He never really does it again until book 3, right? So, again, counting that as an outlier episode, not going to count towards or against the average. You may notice episode 15 has a surprisingly high number of airbends in it, 32. That's the most airbending that Aang does in any single episode. That episode is Bado of the Water Tribe, and I was kind of surprised by this result to have such a high number of airbending in Bado of the Water Tribe. Not an episode I remember there being a whole ton of bending in, but that number is inflated because of the ice running thing they do with Sokka. When he tells Aang to blow a bunch of air into the sail, Aang does it with a bunch of individual air blasts up into it. So I counted each of those individual air blasts as one use of airbending, as opposed to one continuous use of airbending, which I would have counted one continuous use of airbending if he had created like a vortex over his head or something and then just maintained that. But that's not what he did, so it counts as multiple uses of airbending. So I think those are the only sort of remarkable individual episode things that I wanted to note. Let's look at the totals. So, in Book 1, Aang airbends, by my count, a total of 274 times. Way more than the 100 that I suggested at the beginning. He waterbends a total of 30 times, which feels about right for when he actually starts waterbending in episode 9, the waterbending scroll. He earthbends 1 time. As I talked about, we're counting when Aang goes into the Avatar state and channels Roku. That use of lava bending counts as 1 use of earthbending. And then he firebends a total of 7 times between when he is Roku in the Winter Solstice Part 2 and when he's training with Zhang Zhang in The Deserter. So this gives us our percentages. So, of the time that Aang bends over the course of Book 1, he chooses to airbend 87.82% of the time. He chooses to waterbend 9.62% of the time. Earthbends 0.32% of the time, and firebends 2.24% of the time. So, nothing really surprising here about these numbers, except for the fact that the earthbending number is greater than 0% of the time. But yeah, I mean, this makes sense, right? Airbending is still his dominant element. He's learning waterbending over the course of the book, so he does it some, but not nearly as much as he airbends. Almost 90% of the time, he's airbending. This gives us our averages. If we average out the total amount of times that Aang airbends over the course of 20 episodes, that gives us 13.7 airbends per episode. So that's a pretty big number, especially in comparison to waterbending. Aang waterbends 2.3 repeating times per episode with the averages. Now, again, with the averages, with waterbending average, I'm not counting all 20 episodes because Aang doesn't learn to waterbend until episode 9, the waterbending scroll. So only from that point forward do the waterbending numbers count for and against the waterbending average. But what does this tell us about what Aang gravitates to in Book 1? What does it tell us about who Aang is as a bender and as the Avatar in Book 1? I think this just tells us kind of what you'd expect to see in Book 1, right? Aang is still, first and foremost, an airbender. He's growing into his Avatar role. You know, he does learn waterbending in this book. He tries to experiment with firebending in this book. Doesn't go that well with the firebending. Waterbending picks up pretty quickly, pretty easily, but he's still really focusing on that airbending aspect because that's who he is. And, you know, he still has a lot of growing to do. But by the end of the series, you start seeing by the end of the book, rather, you start seeing that waterbending number climbing up a little bit in the last couple episodes. So that's Book 1. Definitely sort of roughly what I expected to find with Book 1. Waterbending, of course, now has a 29 use lead over earthbending, which, as I said in my hypothesis, I believe earthbending is going to end up being Aang's second most used element. So earthbending is going to have to overcome that 29 point deficit here. I think it can still do it. I think that's a very, very doable thing. But we'll only find out by moving on to Book 2. So I'll see you when I'm done watching Book 2. All right, I'm back. Finished watching Book 2 Earth. So let's go over what I noticed generally, episode by episode, and some interesting single episode details here in Book 2. First thing I'm going to point out, you'll notice there's no episode 7 listed on here, and there's no episode 16 listed on here. These episodes are invalid for this experiment. Episode 7 is Zuko alone, and Aang does not show up at all in that episode. So we can't count that episode against any of the averages. Similarly, episode 16, that's Appa's Lost Days. The only bending we see Aang do in episode 16 is a flashback to the desert a few episodes previously, and the examples we see of Aang bending had already been counted in that episode. So we can't count that against the sort of totals here. Aang does have an outlier use of earthbending in episode 1 when he goes into the Avatar state. And I, of course, am not counting that outlier for the averages. Another thing you'll notice, really, really high number of water bends here in episode 13, which is the drill. So what's going on there? Going into the episode, I kind of thought that each brace in the drill was going to be like one use of water bending. But upon watching the episode, Aang fully transfers control over the water when cutting the braces to Katara on each slice. And so I'm going to count that as each time Aang receives the water and then sends it back, that's one. And because we see him and Katara do this a lot of times, that really makes this episode's water total, big. And a lot bigger than anywhere else in the book. Everywhere else in the book, Aang is bending water in the single digits. But in the drill, he bends it 38 times. So that really inflates the amount of water bending Aang does in book 2. So I thought that was interesting. And it sort of, leads me to a conclusion about when Aang water bends, he really water bends. But he doesn't necessarily water bend a ton. Obviously, episode 9, that's Bitter Work. This is the episode where Aang actually learns earthbending from Toph. We see him earthbend twice in that episode successfully. There's an unsuccessful attempt at earthbending. Did not count that, obviously. But as the book goes on, in major fights, Aang starts relying on earthbending more and more. In episode 13, the drill, he earthbends 13 times during the fight on the drill. First time we see him earthbending since Bitter Work. So obviously he's doing some work off screen that we don't see. And again, episode 18, big fight to get to the Earth King. Aang does a lot of earthbending, more than airbending, more than waterbending. And same thing at the last episode of Crossroads of Destiny. During the fight, Aang earthbends 15 times, whereas he only airbends 9 times in this episode, waterbends 1 time in this episode. So you can definitely see him shifting more towards heavy earthbending, which is sort of what I was expecting to see. But it'll be interesting to see how that reflects on the totals and averages and percentages, especially considering this 38 uses of water bending here in the drill. So let's look at the results from book 2. So in book 2, Aang airbends a total of 160 times. He waterbends a total of 57 times. He earthbends a total of 49 times, and he doesn't firebend at all in book 2, not even in any outlier sense. For percentages then, this equates to Aang airbending about 60% of the time, 60.15% of the time. He waterbends 21.43% of the time. He earthbends 18.42% of the time, and he firebends 0% of the time. I think this is actually ends up being kind of interesting. He's still waterbending more than he is earthbending in the grand scheme of things, which surprised me somewhat. I really didn't think Aang waterbent that much in book 2. But again, a lot of that is because of the drill episode. So that really does inflate that waterbending number by quite a bit, which is interesting, but not interesting enough for me to discount that number of times, if that makes sense. I still think it should count towards his totals there. When we control for the number of episodes that Aang had access to each element in the averages, this is where we actually see the shift more in favor of earthbending here. So on average, Aang airbent 8.8 repeating times an episode. He waterbent 3.16, the 6 repeating times per episode, and he earthbent 4.36 repeating times an episode. So, with the averages, we really see there's a big shift towards earthbending here. Earthbending is his second most used element when you look at the averages, because we're only counting, the Bitter Work, episode 9, on from there. I think the other thing that's interesting looking at this is the totals. Aang is still airbending a lot. He's still airbending 160 times in Book 2. That is still more than 100 times less than he airbent in Book 1. So, he's still an airbender at heart, but he's becoming a more well-rounded avatar as the series goes on. He's relying more on the other tools in his tool belt as the series goes on, and as he learns more elements and he figures out, more ways to solve problems than just solely approaching it like an airbender, which is, of course, a huge point in the episode Bitter Work. So definitely some interesting things in the numbers bearing out here. Again, the waterbending number, a lot higher than I expected, almost exclusively because of the episode Drill. Earthbending number is still pretty respectable, given that he only gets earthbending in episode 9. So that's sort of what I was expecting to see, except for the waterbending number. We'll see how that all shakes out with Book 3 added into the mix, see if earthbending can fully overtake waterbending in the totals, and we'll also see where firebending lands when we move on to Book 3. So I'm going to go watch Book 3, and I will see you after I watch Book 3. All right, finished Book 3. Let's take a look at what the numbers tell us. So, a couple things I want to mention right off the bat. You'll notice, just like with Book 2, there's a couple of episodes unaccounted for here in Book 3. And those episodes are 14 and 15. That's the Boiling Rock. Aang does appear very briefly at the beginning of Part 1 and at the end of Part 2. He doesn't do any bending during those periods, and they're so short that I just decided, those episodes don't really count for or against, the averages for Aang's bending, because he's not really an active participant in those episodes. Another thing you might notice, episode 8, Aang doesn't do any bending in episode 8. That really surprised me. Episode 8 is the Puppet Master. This is, of course, an episode that is largely Katara-centric, but Aang is still an active participant in the episode. Like, he's still doing stuff in the episode. But he never bends. He never bends at all over the course of episode 8, which I thought was really surprising, because there's several episodes in here, where Aang's doesn't end up doing a whole lot over the course of the episode, but he still bends some in the episode. So I thought that was really interesting. Another thing that I think is interesting is that bending totals are kind of down across the board in Book 3 versus Book 2 and Book 1. And that's particularly true of airbending. Aang does not do nearly as much airbending in Book 3 as he did in the previous 2 books. And a big part of this is Aang stops using airbending to essentially stand up and sit down. As I mentioned back in Book 1, he does that a lot. He also does that a lot in Book 2. Doesn't do it at all, to my knowledge, in Book 3, to my recollection, right? So really brings that airbending total down, but his bending totals are, again, down across the board. You know, for about the first half, through episode 9, they're sort of undercover, so there's not as much bending that's happening while they're, you know, actively traveling in the Fire Nation. And then after the Day of Black Sun, those are episodes 10 and 11, which you can see, you know, the bending numbers are up, but they're not crazy high in those episodes. But after the Day of Black Sun, you know, when they go back into hiding, the bending numbers do pick up some, but they don't really get crazy high. Aang is tending not to do a whole ton in several of these episodes. Like, you know, Boiling Rock episodes, he's not really an active participant. That's immediately followed by the Southern Raiders. Again, very Katara episode. Aang's not in much of that episode, but he is in the episode, and he does do some bending in that episode, but not a lot, right? So that's how you end up with episode 16, only 2 uses of airbending, and that's it for Aang's bending in that episode. Episode 17, that is, of course, the Ember Island Players episode, one of my personal favorites in terms of just how funny it is, how fun it is. Aang does bend in that episode. The episode starts with Aang practicing firebending, so it definitely still counts, but because he spends almost the entire episode at the play, don't see a ton of bending in that episode. Numbers do pick up in the finale here, right? We can see more bending in the finale here, but frankly, those numbers just aren't as high as I was expecting them to be in the finale. So Book 3 ended up being a really interesting book in terms of the amount of bending Aang did, and especially in terms of airbending. Airbending's way down in Book 3, which I think is interesting. And also, of course, you know, I forgot to mention this, but of course, this is the book where Aang learns firebending. He doesn't get access to firebending really until episode 13, the Firebending Masters. So only that point forward is really going to count for the average bending per episode. So with that, let's look at the results for Book 3, see what that tells us and what we can learn. So, in Book 3, Aang airbends a total of 89 times, he waterbends a total of 32 times, he earthbends a total of 44 times, and he firebends a total of 25 times. Percentage-wise, that equates to Aang airbending 46.84% of the time, waterbending 16.84% of the time, earthbending 23.16% of the time, and firebending 13.16% of the time. This is really pretty interesting to me. So, as I hypothesized at the beginning, I thought Aang was going to end up earthbending more than he ends up waterbending or firebending. At least in Book 3, that is true. Aang's second most used element in Book 3 is earthbending. He uses it, you know, way more than firebending, a little bit more than waterbending. So, and that bears out in the percentages here, right? Also interesting to me, air is obviously Aang's most used element still, right? But he's using it less than half of the time now. The other half of the time he's using the other 3 elements. And again, I think this really demonstrates how much Aang has grown over the course of the series. You know, we talked about that number coming down at the end of Book 2 for airbending as him growing and learning to use the other elements and other strategies depending on the circumstance and situation as kind of a way to demonstrate his growth as the Avatar, a way to show that he was coming into his own. That's even more the case here. Of course he's still an airbender at heart. Of course he's still airbending more than he's bending all the other elements, but he's really spreading around to the different elements in different situations, doing what is best in the given moment, instead of just relying on airbending to get him out of everything. And again, I think that really demonstrates his growth and his maturity during Book 3. Let's look at the averages here. So this is really, really interesting to me here. So Aang airbends an average of 4.68, goes on, the decimal goes on after that, times an episode in Book 3. He waterbends 1.68, some more. decimals in book 3. He earthbends 2.31 times an episode with some more decimals in book 3, and he firebends 3.57, some more decimals, times an episode in book 3. That's a surprising number to me. Now, it's a much smaller sample size we're looking at with firebending, right? As I said, Aang only gets access to firebending starting in episode 13 of book 3, and then there's 2 episodes that don't count for anything. It's 14 and 15. So, and he's firebending 25 times over the course of just a handful of episodes. That is, of course, going to bring this average number up pretty high. But I think it really feels like it when you're actually watching the show. It does feel like he's firebending a lot at the end. And I think these averages really reflect that. I think that's why it's useful to have that averages total, because it can tell you what it feels like is happening over the course of the show. And then the total numbers and percentages tell you what's actually happening over the course of the show, right? So it captures kind of both things. Again, I just think that's an interesting detail. I think I still would have expected the earthbending number for averages to be higher than the firebending number, but that's not the case. So that's what we see in book 3. What do we see for the results for the series as a whole? So, over the course of the entire series, Avatar the Last Airbender, Aang airbends a total of 523 times. He waterbends a total of 119 times, he earthbends a total of 94 times, and he firebends a total of 32 times. I'm surprised. Waterbending comes in second place. It had a lead off of earthbending, that's very true. I still thought earthbending was going to overtake waterbending in the end, but it didn't. Waterbending won out, so waterbending gets the silver medal for total usage over the course of the series. Percentages-wise, this gives Aang an airbending percentage over the series of 68.1%, a waterbending percentage of 15.49%, an earthbending percentage of 12.24%, and a firebending percentage of 4.17%. So this just makes sense in terms of, with the totals too. Obviously, the element Aang knows the entire time is the one he uses the most. The element Aang knows least length of the show is the element he uses the least. So that's what our totals and percentages tell us about the raw numbers here. What do the averages tell us? So on average, Aang airbends 9.17, some more decimals, times per episode. He waterbends 2.38, some more decimals, times per episode. He earthbends 3.06 repeating times per episode, and he firebends. That average is the same for book 3 because the instances in book 1 of him firebending are outliers, right? Which as I said at the beginning, not counting for the averages. So this is the same number as book 3, 3.57, some more decimals, times per episode. So when you look at the averages, even with the averages, earthbending is not Aang's second most used element. Firebending still is, because of the very short amount of time that Aang actually has access to firebending. It makes that average number higher. So really, once Aang gets firebending, he's using that tool second most. And, now having watched through the show, keeping this in mind, keeping these tallies, that does make sense, right? Firebending is relatively easy to access, just like airbending, in terms of, you don't need anything else, right? You can airbend anywhere there's air, you can firebend, basically anywhere. So this does make sense in terms of the averages, but, it does still surprise me. I really did think Aang was earthbending second most, and that's just not the case. in terms of the total numbers, he's waterbending second most. And in terms of the averages, he's firebending second most. Earthbending coming in actually third place by both regards. And also, my thought about Aang not waterbending that much, that does bear out in terms of the averages. Which I think makes sense, right? I think when Aang waterbends, he waterbends in a good, like, cluster. There will be an episode where he does a lot of waterbending here or there. But otherwise, you know, he's breaking it out maybe once in a while. But it's not really an element he really relies on, because water is the element that is most tied to it being available. You know, Earth is pretty widely available, even near water, but waterbending is really only available when you're on the water, or if you're carrying water with you like Tara does. Aang never carries water with him, so that's never really an element that he relies on as much as the others. Even so, just based on the amount of time he has access to it, that does push waterbending into the second place spot. So that is the totals for the whole series. And I do think, again, this tells us something interesting about Aang. You know, Aang is at his core an airbender. And that was never in doubt to me. I never thought that there was ever going to be a time where airbending was not Aang's most used element, and it is. But I think as we see over the course of the series, Aang starts airbending less and relying on the other elements more. That really lines up very well with the character arc that Aang goes on. Aang's character arc over the course of Avatar the Last Airbender was learning to be more mature, learning to be more responsible, learning to be the Avatar. And as he does that, he starts relying more and more on the other elements and what the other elements bring to the table, and on strategies that are really only possible because of the other elements. And that's really what allows Aang to be successful at the end of the series. When he finally defeats Fire Lord Ozai, he's a fully realized Avatar, and watching that growth through the numbers of what elements he bends and when he bends them, I think was an interesting exercise. It only reinforces his character arc and his character journey. It was a great detail of from the creators of the show to show that growth, not only through Aang's behavior, but through his very bending, the very way he interacted with the world using that system. So, thank you all very much for watching this, for joining me to see Avatar by the numbers, essentially. I'm probably going to rewatch Korra next, so I'll probably do the same thing with Legend of Korra. And so I hope you'll join me for that. But thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Keep an eye out for the Korra version of this. And we'll see you all next time. Have a good one.